How? Demanded the captured Vorthak engineer, his mental voice tinged with something that might charitably be called professional curiosity and uncharitably be called existential terror. Chen shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey the entire human approach to scientific advancement. We tried stuff until it worked. Also, we used duct tape. You guys really need to invest in better duct tape. Meanwhile, Major Elena Vasquez had discovered that human civilians, when properly motivated, displayed an alarming tendency to treat military occupation like a particularly annoying home renovation project. Her resistance cells operated out of coffee shops and community centers, coordinated through social media platforms, and somehow managed to stay ahead of alien intelligence networks that could theoretically read thoughts. "They're predicting our movements," complained the Vorthak tactical coordinator. "Impossible," Zarothan replied. "They have no telepathic capabilities. Then how are they always 3 steps ahead of us?" The answer, had the Vorthak been capable of understanding it, was that humans had spent their entire evolutionary history dealing with other humans, who were arguably the most unpredictable and unreasonable species in the galaxy. Fighting aliens was actually refreshingly straightforward by comparison. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, whose tactical philosophy could be summarized as, if it's stupid and it works, it's not stupid, had begun treating alien battle formations like elaborate puzzles that could be solved through lateral thinking and strategic applications of what his grandmother would have called good old-fashioned spite. His most celebrated victory involved convincing an entire Vorthak battalion that they were under attack by invisible humans, using nothing but carefully placed sound effects and the aliens' own telepathic abilities against them. The battalion spent 3 days fighting shadows, while Morrison's actual forces looted their supply depot. "Sir," his communications specialist reported after that particular engagement, "the enemy commander is requesting clarification on our phantom warfare protocols." Morrison grinned. "Tell him we'll send him the manual after we finish writing it." The Confederation's military experts found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to completely revise their understanding of warfare. Humans, it seemed, approached combat with the same creative chaos they applied to everything else. They used kitchen implements as weapons, turned children's toys into communication devices, and somehow managed to coordinate complex military operations using platforms originally designed for sharing pictures of food. More disturbing still was their apparent inability to recognize when they were beaten. Traditional military doctrine suggested that a species would surrender when faced with overwhelming odds and inevitable defeat. Humans, conversely, seemed to interpret impossible odds as a personal challenge. "They're fighting harder now than when we started," observed Commander Cora, reviewing the latest battle reports with something approaching intellectual vertigo. "This violates every principle of rational military behavior." "Perhaps," suggested his aide. "They don't understand they're losing." "They understand perfectly. They just don't seem to care." The truth was more unsettling than either alien commander could grasp. Humans had evolved on a planet that specialized in creative attempts at mass extinction. They'd survived ice ages, volcanic winters, plague outbreaks, and approximately 6,000 years of trying to eliminate each other over philosophical differences. Being invaded by superior alien forces was actually a relatively familiar scenario, conceptually speaking. Captain Rodriguez, now commanding a fleet of jury-rigged human-alien hybrid vessels that looked like they'd been assembled by enthusiastic children with unlimited access to spare parts, had begun treating interstellar warfare like an elaborate game of chess, where she was allowed to ignore the rules and occasionally set the board on fire. "Ma'am," her tactical officer reported, "we're outnumbered 12-1, outgunned by approximately 3 orders of magnitude, and our shields are held together with what Dr. Chen insists on calling theoretical physics and wishful thinking." "Excellent," Rodriguez replied. "They'll never expect us to attack." The Battle of Luna became the stuff of galactic legend primarily because it shouldn't have been possible. Rodriguez's makeshift fleet, consisting of repurposed cargo haulers, converted civilian vessels, and at least one craft that appeared to be held together entirely by moral support and strategic applications of welding, somehow managed to outmaneuver and defeat a Vorthak battle group that had conquered 17 star systems. The secret, had anyone thought to ask, was that humans had never learned proper military tactics. They'd instead developed what could charitably be called aggressive problem-solving, and what their enemies were beginning to recognize as weaponized chaos theory. Dr. Chen's engineering teams had discovered that alien technology, while undeniably advanced, was designed by species that thought in predictable patterns. Human technology, conversely, was designed by beings who'd spent millennia trying to outsmart other humans, resulting in systems that were simultaneously overcomplicated and surprisingly robust. Their quantum processors are more advanced than ours, Chen explained to a gathering of human military leaders, but they're also incredibly logical. They process information in sequential patterns that make perfect sense. Our computers, on the other hand, are basically electronic representations of human thought processes, which means they're chaotic, unpredictable, and somehow manage to work, despite violating several fundamental principles of computer science. Major Vasquez resistance networks had evolved into something that defied classification by any known military doctrine. They operated more like social movements than traditional military units, spreading through communities with the same organic unpredictability that characterized human viral videos and conspiracy theories. They're not following any recognizable command structure, reported the Vorthak intelligence coordinator, his mental voice carrying notes of genuine bewilderment. Their operational cells seem to coordinate through shared cultural references and what our linguists can only describe as collaborative sarcasm. The concept of human pack bonding, while noted in the original xenobiological surveys, had been filed under mildly interesting social behaviors rather than critical military intelligence. This proved to be a significant oversight. Humans, it turned out, fought harder for each other than they did for abstract concepts like territory or ideology. More problematically, they seemed to adopt anyone who fought alongside them, including captured alien personnel who'd been treated with basic human decency. Lieutenant Morrison's unit had somehow managed to recruit a small squadron of Vorthak deserters who'd apparently never encountered a species that shared food with prisoners and asked about their families during interrogations. The psychological warfare implications were staggering. "Sir," reported the Vorthak tactical coordinator, They're teaching our people their card games." Admiral Zarothane's crystalline equivalent of a migraine was reaching epic proportions. "Explain." "Poker, sir. They've introduced our captured personnel to something called poker. Our telepathic advantages are apparently irrelevant because the humans have developed a form of mental discipline they call bluffing, which seems to involve deliberately thinking false thoughts while maintaining emotional equilibrium." The Confederation's emergency council session was called after the 4th Vorthak battle group reported tactical difficulties with human forces. The assembly chamber, which had witnessed debates over the fate of entire star systems, now found itself struggling to comprehend reports that defied every established principle of military science. "They cannot be defeated through conventional means," Commander Korath reported, his crystalline form dimming with what might charitably be called intellectual exhaustion. "They adapt faster than we can develop countermeasures. They ignore tactical doctrine. They treat military engagements like elaborate social activities. And most disturbing of all, they seem to be enjoying themselves." "Enjoying themselves?" inquired the Kelleran representative, whose merchant instincts were simultaneously horrified and intrigued by the economic implications. "Their combat communications are filled with what our linguists have identified as humor and casual banter. They appear to find warfare entertaining." The final straw came when Captain Rodriguez's fleet successfully captured a Confederation dreadnought, using tactics that violated approximately 17 different laws of physics and at least 3 fundamental principles of military strategy. The operation had been coordinated through what human military historians would later describe as a group chat with delusions of grandeur, and executed with the kind of cheerful chaos that characterized human approaches to impossible problems. "How?" demanded Admiral Zarothane, reviewing the tactical recordings for the 15th time. "Their strategy makes no logical sense." "Sir," his aide replied carefully, "I don't think it was supposed to make sense. I think that was the point." The Confederation's Xenopsychology Department, faced with the impossible task of analyzing human military behavior, eventually submitted a report that essentially amounted to a formal academic shrug. Humans, they concluded, approached warfare with the same creative chaos they applied to art, science, and social media. They were simultaneously too unpredictable to counter and too adaptable to contain. More troubling still was their apparent immunity to conventional psychological warfare. Threats that would terrify most species were met with curiosity. Overwhelming displays of force were treated as engineering challenges, and somehow, impossibly, they seemed to thrive under conditions that should have broken their morale completely. The turning point came when Dr. Chen's research teams successfully reverse-engineered not just alien technology, but alien strategic thinking. Human-designed battle computers, programmed with creative chaos algorithms and what Chen cheerfully called artificial intuition, began outmaneuvering Confederation tactical systems with embarrassing consistency. "They've weaponized randomness," reported the Vorthak Strategic Analysis Division. "Their combat decisions are simultaneously logical and completely unpredictable. It's like fighting an opponent who changes the rules of mathematics mid-calculation." The first official Confederation retreat in recorded history was authorized after Rodriguez's expanding fleet, now including captured alien vessels, operated by human crews who'd learned alien technology through YouTube tutorials and trial-and-error experimentation, successfully defended the Sol system against a full battle group. The engagement was later studied in military academies across the galaxy, primarily as an example of how superior technology and numerical advantages could be overcome through creative applications of physics, engineering, and what military analysts struggled to categorize as anything other than weaponized stubbornness. Commander Cora found himself composing the most unusual threat assessment in Confederation history. Earth's new classification required entirely new categories. Traditional metrics like technological advancement and military capability seemed inadequate for describing a species that had somehow managed to become the galaxy's most effective military force through creative chaos and aggressive problem-solving. The final report, stamped with security classifications that would keep it locked away for several centuries, contained recommendations that would have seemed unthinkable just months earlier. Earth was to be reclassified as a Class I strategic threat. All hostile operations were to be suspended immediately, and most remarkably, the Confederation formally requested a non-aggression pact with humanity. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. Earth's humans, dismissed as primitive curiosities barely worth cataloguing, had become the galaxy's most feared military force, not through superior technology or ancient wisdom, but through the simple act of being unpredictably, chaotically, stubbornly human. Captain Rodriguez, now Admiral Rodriguez and commander of humanity's first interstellar defense force, received the Confederation's formal surrender with the kind of gracious professionalism that somehow made their victory even more unsettling to their former enemies. "Thank you for the paperwork," she told the Confederation diplomatic team. "We'll file it right next to our surrender procedures, which we're still working on. Turns out we're not very good at giving up." Dr. Chen's laboratories had become pilgrimage sites for alien scientists, trying to understand how human creativity could overcome theoretical limitations. His latest project involved teaching artificial intelligence systems to think irrationally, which he claimed was the key to solving impossible problems. "Logic," he explained to a gathering of bewildered Zephyrian researchers, "is just a starting point. Real breakthroughs happen when you're willing to try things that shouldn't work, especially when you don't understand why they shouldn't work." Major Vasquez resistance networks had evolved into something resembling a galactic social movement, spreading human concepts like question authority and creative problem-solving throughout Confederation space. Several alien species had reportedly begun developing their own versions of human-style organized chaos, much to their government's alarm. Lieutenant Morrison, now General Morrison, had established the galaxy's first military academy dedicated to teaching adaptive tactical creativity, which attracted students from across the Confederation, despite the fact that the curriculum appeared to consist largely of improvisation exercises and strategic applications of humor. The Confederation's official files now listed Earth as chaotic neutral, approach with extreme caution, a classification that came with detailed warnings about human unpredictability and recommendations for diplomatic rather than military contact. The footnotes alone filled several volumes and included helpful advice like, "Do not attempt to intimidate. and avoid challenging them to prove impossibilities possible. Years later, as humanity took its place among the galaxy's major powers, alien military historians would struggle to explain how the most feared species in known space had achieved their status not through conquest or superior technology, but through sheer bloody-minded refusal to follow anyone else's rules. The humans themselves remained characteristically modest about their achievements. When asked to explain their success, they typically shrugged and offered variations of, "We just did what seemed reasonable at the time," a response that continued to terrify military strategists across the galaxy. And somewhere in the Confederation archives, filed under Lessons Learned the Hard Way, sat Commander Korath's final report on humanity, its conclusion, written in the careful prose of someone who'd learned to respect the galaxy's most dangerous species, read simply, "Recommendation: do not attempt to apply logic to human behavior. Also, invest heavily in duct tape futures." The galaxy, it seemed, would never be quite the same, and humanity, as usual, was perfectly fine with that. The Interstellar Confederation had, over the course of 17 millennia, developed what they considered a rather elegant system for categorizing the galaxy's sentient species. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic efficiency, complete with color-coded threat assessments, evolutionary sophistication indexes, and enough paperwork to choke a Proximan whale. At the apex of this cosmic pecking order sat the Zephyrin Empire, beings of living crystal, whose thoughts moved at light speed and whose military strategies were calculated down to the quantum level. Just below them lurked the Vorthak Collective, telepathic warriors who could read an enemy's battle plans before the enemy had finished thinking them. And then, somewhere near the bottom of this galactic food chain, barely registering above the classification of moderately concerning space algae, sat a small blue-green planet called Earth, inhabited by what the official records diplomatically termed primitive carbon-based curiosities with alarming reproductive tendencies. Commander Tylex Korath, whose crystalline form hummed with the accumulated wisdom of 3,000 years, found himself reviewing Earth's file for the 15th time that cycle. The threat assessment made for rather amusing reading. Physical capabilities, laughably inadequate. Mental capacity, barely sufficient for basic tool use. Technological advancement, primitive combustion engines and rudimentary electronics. Military sophistication, still throwing projectiles at each other, though they had recently progressed from rocks to metal pellets. The humans, according to the Confederation's exhaustive xenobiological surveys, possessed no telepathic abilities, no natural armor, no enhanced strength, and apparently spent most of their brief lifespans arguing about imaginary lines drawn on maps, and which invisible sky being preferred which day of the week for worship. Their greatest military achievement appeared to be the development of increasingly creative ways to eliminate their own species. "Fascinating," Korath mused, his crystalline voice chiming like wind through a cave of precious stones. "They've managed to survive this long despite being essentially bipedal disaster magnets." The Confederation's Council of Species had been debating Earth's fate for approximately 30 standard years, which in galactic political terms was roughly equivalent to clearing one's throat before speaking. The Zephyrines wanted to study them. The Vorthak wanted to conquer them for sport. The Kelleran Merchant Guild wanted to exploit their natural resources. Eventually, as was the way with all great bureaucratic decisions, they settled on a compromise that satisfied no one. A standard pacification protocol, followed by integration into the Confederation as a Class VV subsidiary species, which was how Admiral Vex Zarathen of the Vorthak Collective found himself leading what amounted to the galaxy's most overqualified pest control operation. His fleet consisted of 12 battle cruisers, each capable of glassing a continent, supported by enough firepower to sterilize a small moon. For a species that still used chemical propulsion to reach their own satellite, it was rather like bringing a plasma cannon to a food fight. "This should be concluded within one planetary rotation," Zarathen informed his subordinates, his mental voice carrying the distinctive arrogance that came with having never met a species that couldn't be conquered through superior firepower and tactical telepathy. "Standard protocol: demonstrate overwhelming force, wait for inevitable surrender, process integration paperwork. The initial human response seemed to confirm every assumption in their files. Earth's governments dissolved into chaos, their primitive communication networks buzzed with panic, and their military forces scattered like startled herbivores. Several nations immediately attempted to surrender to beings they'd never seen, which the Vorthak found both pathetic and oddly endearing. Then the humans did something unexpected. They stopped following the script. Captain Maya Rodriguez, whose military career had been built on the distinctly human philosophy that rules were more like suggestions anyway, found herself staring at impossible odds with the kind of grin that historically preceded either brilliant victories or spectacular disasters. While her superiors attempted to coordinate a proper military response through the appropriate channels, Rodriguez had already begun what she cheerfully termed aggressive improvisation. "Sir," her communications officer reported, "the aliens are demanding we surrender according to their standard pacification protocols. They've sent us a 17-page document outlining proper surrender procedures." Rodriguez glanced at the document, which included helpful diagrams and appeared to have been translated into approximately 47 different languages, none of which were human. "Counter-proposal," she said. "Tell them we haven't read their terms and conditions, and we're going to assume they're full of legal loopholes." What followed could charitably be described as the galaxy's first encounter with human military doctrine, which seemed to consist entirely of creative interpretations of the phrase, "That probably won't work, but let's try it anyway." The Vorthak had expected organized resistance. They'd prepared for guerrilla warfare. They'd even anticipated the possibility of desperate last stands and heroic sacrifices. What they hadn't expected was for the humans to treat interstellar warfare like an elaborate game, where the rules were optional and creativity was worth more points than common sense. Dr. Felix Chen, whose scientific career had been built on the principle that impossible was really just another word for nobody's tried hard enough yet, managed to reverse engineer alien shielding technology using nothing but salvaged debris and what he cheerfully called the scientific method plus desperation. His team had the first human-alien hybrid weapons operational within a week, despite the fact that such technology should have required decades of research and development.